Hello, everybody. It took a little bit of technical difficulty, but we are here. I'm Samantha Steiner, and this is the community live stream in multilingual nonfiction writing. And here we've got some very low-tech, lovely demos. These are
Hello, everybody.
Nonfiction writing. I'm going to talk a little bit about the class itself before we go on and get into the nitty-gritty. So I'll talk a little about me. We'll talk a little bit about the class. And then we'll talk a little bit about writing prompts and what we'll be doing at home. So about me, I was born and raised in New York City to English-speaking parents, but with a babysitter from Argentina. And so I've had a very interesting life experience with that. I grew up bilingual, but Spanish was really the language I used to communicate with my brother, who also grew up under the same circumstances because my parents didn't speak Spanish. My babysitter didn't speak English. In high school and then all through college, I kept taking Spanish classes because I didn't want to lose my proficiency with the language. And then I graduated with a degree in comparative literature in English and Spanish from undergrad. I went on to do a Fulbright scholarship in Argentina, where I lived for a year. And then I'm in my last semester at the MFA program at Sarah Lawrence, studying nonfiction writing. And so in my time at Sarah Lawrence, I've been working as an editor for Lumina Journal, managing both the multilingual section and the multimedia section. So multilingualism is my thing. Okay, so for the class itself, it's going to be structured over the course of 5 weeks. And each week is broken down by topic. So for the first week, we're going to talk about the many kinds of multilingualism. In the second week, we'll talk about familiar languages, or languages we feel we know well, but that maybe our readers don't, and how to bring them into conversation with us. And then week 3, we'll talk about unfamiliar languages. So languages that we're still learning or that we don't feel comfortable with, but that are meaningful to us nonetheless. And so how to talk about a language where maybe we don't have the confidence that we feel entitled to talk about it, but I believe there's a space there. And how to be respectful of other cultures and other languages. And then finally, almost finally, for the 4th class, we'll talk about languages for a goal. And so if we're doing all of this work of bringing other languages with which maybe our readers or ourselves we don't feel comfortable, there needs to be a good reason for that. There needs to be a really strong payoff for the reader. And so we'll talk about what kinds of payoffs we can put into our writing so that our languages are feeding us and feeding our readers in really fun ways. And then finally, the 5th class is really up to us. Any questions that arise, anything that pops up, anything that we're curious about. And so I invite everybody to send me comments or messages or emails. I'll include my email at the end of the class and talk about what makes you tick. And we can delve into all of that. And finally, homework and writing prompts. So there will be a writing prompt at the end of each live stream. Usually prompts are about 400 words, which is double spaced, less than a page. Prompts are completely optional. I think they're really fun. I think that doing the prompts helps us teach ourselves how to write. So I strongly recommend them, but they're not required. There's no required reading either. I want this class to be maximally accessible to anyone at any level in their learning. So take your time with it. Take what feels useful to you. Leave behind the rest. And with that, let's delve into things. So this is officially the start of week 1, many kinds of multilingual. So in order to talk about languages, we need to know what language is. And so according to good old Google, language is a system of communication used by a particular country or community. This feels really interesting to me. I mean, if we're going to break it down really as to be as simple as we can, it's a system of communication. So language is anything that communicates. It's anything that represents something else, right? If it communicates something. And that idea of a country or a community, it's creating a country or a community. Language has this incredible power because it's creating inclusion and sometimes exclusion in really powerful ways. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward, like what can be a language? So we've got our standard idea of language, which is summarized in this mishmash, right? Languages that we learn from listening at home, languages we might learn in school, languages that are spoken or written. And there are also many kinds of sign language. And we're gonna move past those traditional ideas of language to include something even bigger. Let's talk about the language of math, right? All of these symbols mean things. We know that these two parallel lines, they could mean anything. They could mean a road, they could mean a river. But in the context of math, in this language, they mean equals. And that equal symbol is going to come back to be really useful for us. Let's move past math to something a little more elaborate, right? So this is actually the Pythagorean theorem in an image. So big square is a plus b squared. Here's a, here's b, so that's the one side. And if you square that, that'll give you the area of the big square. And so again, I would not know that a plus b means what it means, that it means this entire length if I had not had some training and how to understand that. So the same way that we can learn the mathematical alphabet and put it together into something meaningful, into a kind of story, we can do that with other languages too. Okay, I have a comic here. The text is a little small, but I'm going to try to zoom in. So here we've got, also this is a page from Scott McCloud's book, Comics, which I highly, highly recommend. And so we have this famous painting of a pipe. And so our protagonist here, Scott McCloud, he's saying, well, okay, here's a painting by Magritte called The Treachery of Images. The inscription is in French. Translated, it means this is not a pipe. And indeed, this is not a pipe. This is a painting of a pipe, right? Now we know it's not that simple. Well, actually, that's wrong. This is not a painting of a pipe. This is a drawing of a painting of a pipe. N'est-ce pas? Nope, wrong again. It's a printed copy of a drawing of a painting of a pipe, right? This is not the original drawing. 10 copies, actually. 6 if you fold the pages back, right? We've got 6 here. We've got 10 in total. And then he gives us this adorable stare of knowledge. Okay, do you hear what I'm saying? If you do, have your ears checked because no one said a word. So this comic to me is totally about language and about translation. We've got the idea that the pipe can be turned into a painting, can be turned into a drawing, can be turned into 10 drawings. This replication of an original item, right? It's a form of translation. And then, do you hear what I'm saying? No one said a word. That's another kind of translation, that in the language of comics, a speech bubble, right? This arbitrary little bloop means someone is talking. And so again, that took training for all of us to be able to understand. So I think we have it established that languages exist in so many forms, and we can take it even further to in a poker game. When someone has a tell, when we learn to read their behavior, you know, if they're sweating or if they tend to touch their face, that's a sign of nervousness. And then more generally, just body language. And so it doesn't feel like a controversial argument to say that language is almost everything we do, or almost everything that we use to communicate to other people, consciously or not. Okay, so there are lots of kinds of language. There's an overwhelming number of kinds of languages. Now, let's go to the question of translation. And so I call this to Plato or to Nietzsche. Yeah, so first, of all, Plato and Nietzsche, two very famous philosophers, neither of them ever wrote anything about translation itself, but their philosophies had a lot of influence on how translators approach their work. So first, let's take this dramatic looking photo of Plato here, staring off into the distance, thinking many philosophical thoughts. Plato's argument basically was that humans had a soul. This is one of many arguments that he made, but he believed that there was some essence to human beings that lived after they died, and that there is something stable, something meaningful, something that cannot be altered within each of us. And so translators can carry this idea into their work, and the idea that every word has a soul, that words represent things that exist outside of those words. For example, a loaf of bread, that bread or that breadiness is something outside of the word bread in English or pan in Spanish or whatever other word in whatever other language that we might use. There's something that makes all of those variations one thing, makes them the same. And so if that's the case, then a translator's job is really just to transport meaning from one language to the next language. That the translator should basically be invisible in his work. You shouldn't even know he was there or that they were there. And so often translation is compared to clothing. So if the meaning, the essential content of a piece is like the person inside, that the translator is simply dressing up this person to bring him into whatever society the language needs to be brought to. Okay, so that's Plato. Basically, the translator should be invisible, and that the word should be preserved or contained or somehow replicated. This is really, I would argue, an inherently impossible task because words change meaning over time, right? A word that means something in this century might mean something very different next century. For example, flossing used to be unarguably about dental hygiene, and now it's a dance craze. And even if we're using flossing to talk about dental hygiene, it's always going to carry that connotation, that reminder of the dance craze, at least until the craze passes. And then who knows what the word flossing will come to mean. So if you are a Platonian translator, your work is inherently impossible, but the idea is to come as close as possible to delivering the meaning in a way that feels like you were never there. Okay, here's the second dude. Here's Nietzsche. Look at him with his big hipster mustache, staring off into space, thinking his big philosophical thoughts. So Nietzsche's argument, we're going to actually look at the text itself here. I'm going to read it first, and then I'll hold up the text so that everyone else can, if they feel like it, hit the pause button and read through the words and just sort of process them. So this is from Nietzsche's work on Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. Just as it is certain that one leaf is never totally the same as another, so it is certain that the concept of leaf is formed by arbitrarily discarding these individual differences and by forgetting the distinguishing aspects. And I'll hold this up here for anyone who wants to learn visually rather than orally. And then let's talk about what this means. So if we go on a walk outside and see all of the leaves falling from the trees or still on the trees, every leaf is different from all of the others. And so what makes them all leaves? Basically, that we're able to overlook these differences and see similarities, that maybe they have greenness in common, or maybe they have a shape in common, or maybe just the context of hanging from tree branches is enough. But somehow we forget the things that individualize these leaves and in our minds lump them all together. So this is where that equal sign from our language of math comes in. We are actually drawing one big equal sign over every leaf we see, that this leaf equals that leaf equals the other leaf. Because if not, we would encounter an endless number of distinct objects, right? If there were a name for every individual leaf, um, if one was called leaf and the other was called leafo and the other was called leafy, um, the recognizing those differences probably wouldn't serve us in our day-to-day life. And so language is very practical like that. We make the distinctions where we need to. But for us, leaves are all leaves. Um, Unless we happen to be more knowledgeable or more interested in leaves, and then we might be able to tell an oak leaf from a maple leaf and so on. So Nietzsche's argument is basically that um, in translating, we are necessarily changing, we are necessarily forgetting. And again, Nietzsche never wrote directly about translation as far as we know, but his ideas influenced many translators. Okay, here we've got another one from old Nietzsche. What then is truth? A movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified, transferred, and embellished, and which, after long usage, seem to a people to be fixed, canonical, and binding. Truths are illusions, which we have forgotten are illusions. This is some politically loaded stuff. I'm going to hold this up again. If anyone wants to hit pause and just read through this, it takes a little time to absorb everything he's saying here. Okay, so what is truth? So when we talk about truth, we're also sort of talking about a soul, right? This idea that there's something that's stable and fixed in the world that might live even after all of us die. So truth, according to Nietzsche, is a movable host of metaphors. Truth is inherently unstable. And so metaphor, again, is a form of translation. We're having one object stand in as symbol for another. And so truth is just as uncertain as anything else. According to Nietzsche, the truth is something we construct in order to live our everyday lives. Truths are illusions, which we have forgotten are illusions. And so just as we decide all the leaves are leaves, and this feels very true to us, who's to say that to someone else, all of these leaves are completely distinct objects, that they aren't categorized this way? And so everything boils down to this $1 million word, convention. This is the thing that keeps us from going insane and saying nothing means not anything, and that everything is arbitrary and that meaning is always changing and it's so unstable. So why even bother with the project of translation, right? Because if we're going to say that this leaf equals that leaf and so on, like how do we keep from descending into chaos? And so convention is the answer. We decide as a community or as a country or as a society what is true. And then we stick to those truths in order to cooperate with each other. And so convention is really what we're playing upon in this class. We're going to talk about what the conventions of one language are, and the culture attached to that language, and then what the cultures of another language are, and sort of how we can, or the conventions of that other language are, and how we can bring out the tension, right? Because tension is conflict and conflict is story. That's what we're looking for. And so I think if we can find ways to highlight the ways in which languages are different from each other, that's a story. Okay, let's talk about our prompt for this week, and take a little time to start to brainstorm how we might tackle this prompt. This week, in no more than 400 words, write a true story about how you learned a language. The language could be spoken, written, or signed. It could be English, or it could be something entirely unexpected. Find ways to help your reader learn the language with you. And the reason that I decided on this prompt was because I feel one of the easiest ways for me to delve into writing about language is delving into how I learned that language, right? If we're starting from zero, from a place of not knowing and gradually introducing ourselves as characters to a language. And we can gradually introduce our readers at the same time. This is a trick I actually learned in Aaron Sorkin's master class. Always have someone in the room who doesn't know anything about anything, who's starting from zero. And that person can sort of play the audience, so that as everything is being explained to this new person, it's also being explained to the audience. And so here in this prompt, I'm asking us to be that person. And so if I want to talk about the way in which I learned Spanish, I feel that I don't even remember learning Spanish. And I imagine a lot of people feel that way for languages that they learned from birth. But I remember when I learned that Spanish was different from English. And that was a really fun, exciting moment for me. I kept saying words to my parents that they did not understand, and feeling frustrated. But I felt that I was speaking very clearly. And then eventually I put it together that there was another word for the same thing I was talking about. For example, a cup of juice. I would say Hugo, Hugo. And my parents would wonder, who is Hugo? And so eventually that morphed into me going to the fridge and gesturing, right? I resorted to another kind of language. And so in my case, that was me learning just that I was learning Spanish, that Spanish was something different from English. And so that would be my story for this week. But if you have a language that you learned only orally, right, only by listening, or in some other non-written way, this brings up a new problem, right? How do we put these languages on the page? And so this is where the big debate between Plato and Nietzsche comes up. Do we try to be loyal or faithful or invisible somehow in our translations and do a terrifying amount of research to figure out how to write every single word, which the reader then will most likely not understand? Or do we try to invent something a little more accessible? And so I propose that for a language that anyone doesn't feel confident writing, to invent a pronunciation. And in order to show some respect for the people who speak that language and make it clear that you as author are not attempting to represent all of them, to just make it clear this was my experience. This is how I felt about this language. And there are quiet, quick ways to do that without impeding the flow of the narrative. And then if maybe the language can't be easily translated by pronunciation, maybe just the sounds of it to describe, if there was a popping sound or if it was a boxy, blocky kind of language, or if it was the kind of language that you spoke only at home or only at school, and how you felt when you spoke, how your tongue moved inside of your mouth. I think these details can, in some ways, translate a language better than simply planting the words on the page. So you can see my side in the debate is so clearly Nietzsche, that it's much more exciting and much more fun to invent something new, to create some sort of hybrid out of one language and another in the process of translation. And so with that said, if anyone chooses to tackle the prompt and feels like sharing, this is completely non-mandatory, feel free to email me or message me at any of these resources. I'm going to hold this up for a little while. You can email me at samanthasteiner@alumni.brown.edu. If you feel like browsing my website, you can take a peek at some of the things I've done, or follow me on Twitter or Instagram. And I'm very excited to hear about what people write. So thank you for tuning in. Wishing everybody a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and looking forward to next week.